I burned down my fire lookout tower. Here's why they said the fire started because of stress-induced negligence. That's the official line in the file sitting on the sheriff's desk right now. Isolation psychosis, the state psychiatrist called it a fancy way of saying that being alone in the sky for 3 months made my brain eat itself. They think I snapped. They think I doused the support legs with the emergency fuel reserves, lit a match, and tried to cremate myself along with the Tom Head lookout tower. It's a clean explanation. It explains the screaming the hikers heard. It explains the frantic, nonsensical radio transmissions recorded by the base station. It explains why I jumped from 40 feet up, shattering my ankle and turning my life into a permanent limp. It explains everything except for the piece of charcoal the doctors pulled out of the sole of my boot in the emergency room. It wasn't just burnt wood. It was a fragment of a root twisted and knotted by human hands with a single unblinking eye carved into the charred surface. I didn't put that there, I didn't carve it. And I certainly didn't invite the 12 figures who stood at the base of my tower watching me burn with the patience of stone statues. But you can't tell the police that the forest has teeth. You can't tell them that silence isn't empty, it's just holding its breath. So I'm telling you. Because unlike the sheriff, you might actually listen when I tell you that the things watching us from the tree line aren't always animals. It sounded like the perfect escape. That was the trap. It always starts with the promise of peace. I was 24, drowning in student loans for a degree I never finished, and running from a suffocating cloud of city noise and personal failure. The job listing was practically invisible, buried in the back pages of a government forestry forum. Fire lookout, seasonal, Tom Head Peak. Experience preferred, solitude required. I didn't have the experience, but God knows I had the need for solitude. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to be a ghost in a machine, just a set of eyes scanning the horizon, disconnected from the rent notices and the disappointed voicemails from my parents. The pay was decent, the housing was free, and the nearest human being would be a 20-mile hike away. It felt like salvation. I didn't know then that there are places on a map where you don't go to find yourself. You go there to be found by something else. The drive up to the trailhead took 6 hours from Sacramento, the landscape bleeding from gray concrete to dusty gold, and finally into the deep bruising green of the Mendocino National Forest. My truck, a beat-up Ford that smelled permanently of stale coffee and transmission fluid, groaned as the elevation climbed. The air thinned out, becoming crisp and sharp-smelling of pine resin and baked earth. By the time I parked at the cutoff, the silence was already pressing against my eardrums. It wasn't the quiet of a library or an empty house. It was a physical weight, a vast, indifferent pressure that made the ringing in my ears sound like a scream. I shouldered my pack, 60 pounds of canned food, books, and clothes, and started the hike. The trail to Tom Head wasn't a path so much as a suggestion, a scar of dirt cutting through manzanita and scrub oak before rising into the heavy timber of ponderosa pines and Douglas firs. The trees here were ancient, their bark thick and puzzled like dragon scales, towering giants that blocked out the afternoon sun. I remember the feeling of being small. That's the first seduction of the wilderness. It strips away your ego. You feel insignificant. And for a guy like me who felt the weight of the world, that insignificance was a relief. But as I climbed higher, the air grew colder and the shadows lengthened, stretching across the trail like grasping fingers. I reached the tower just as the sun began to dip below the Yola Bali Range. It was an impressive, terrifying structure. A steel and timber skeleton rising 50 feet into the air, capped with a 14 by 14-foot wooden cab wrapped in glass. It looked like a lighthouse for a sea of trees. The legs were bolted into the granite bedrock of the peak, cross-braced with heavy beams that groaned in the wind. A steep, narrow staircase zigzagged up the center, open to the air. I climbed it, my boots clanging on the metal grates, the wind whipping at my jacket, trying to push me back down. When I reached the catwalk, the view stole the breath from my lungs. Endless ridges of green and blue rolling out like waves to the edge of the world. No roads, no power lines, no people. just me and the sky. I unlocked the heavy trapdoor and pushed my way into the cab. It smelled of old wood, propane, and a faint lingering scent of tobacco from whoever had manned the post the season before. The room was sparse. A cot in the corner, a central pedestal with the Osborne fire finder. The holy grail of the lookout, a circular map with a sighting device, a propane stove, a small table, and the radio. The walls were glass, waist-high to the ceiling. It was a fishbowl. That was my first thought. I was an ant in a glass jar, and the whole world was outside looking in. I unpacked my gear, the mundane domesticity of stacking cans of chili and arranging my paperback books, feeling absurdly small against the panoramic backdrop of the wilderness. I keyed the radio for the first time that evening. The handset felt heavy, cold plastic against my palm. "Base, this is Tom Head. Caleb reporting in. Over." Static hissed back at me, a white noise that sounded like rain on pavement. Then a voice cut through, gravelly and distorted, but undeniably human. "Copy, Tom Head." "Loud and clear. Welcome to the penthouse, kid. This is Ray at base. You get settled in all right?" "Yeah, Ray, just unpacking. View is a lot." Ray chuckled, a dry sound like boots crunching on dry leaves. "It usually is. Don't stare at it all at once. Break it down into quadrants. Otherwise the scale of it will make you dizzy. You got enough water in the tank?" "Checked it. Tank's full." "Good. Weather report says dry lightning expected later in the week. Keep your eyes peeled. And Caleb." "Yeah, Ray. Don't spend all night looking out the windows. It gets dark up there, darker than you're used to. Sometimes your eyes start playing tricks on you if you stare at the black too long. Get some sleep." "Will do. Tom Head out." The first 2 weeks were a honeymoon. I fell into a rhythm that felt almost monastic. Wake up with the sun brew coffee that tasted like heaven in the thin air. Check in with Ray, sweep the horizon with binoculars read, "Eat, Sleep." The isolation washed over me like a cleansing tide. My anxiety about the debts and the city faded, replaced by the immediate concerns of wind direction and cloud formations. I learned the landscape intimately. I knew which ridges caught the morning light first, which valleys held the fog until noon. I named the squirrels that scampered across the catwalk. I felt like a guardian, a silent sentinel protecting this vast breathing organism. But the tower had a voice. I learned that in the second week. At night, when the wind picked up, coming off the Pacific and channeling through the valleys, the structure would sing. It wasn't a mechanical creaking. It was a harmonic vibration. The steel tension rods would hum a low, mournful cello note that vibrated in the floorboards and up through the legs of my cot. And the wind whistling through the gaps in the window frames sounded eerily like a human whistle. Not a melody, just a long two-note call. Hoo-wee, hoo-wee, low and high. I'd wake up at 2:00 a.m. heart-hammering, convinced someone was standing on the catwalk whistling for a dog. I'd grab my flashlight and shine it out into the void, the beam catching nothing but swirling dust motes and the reflection of my own pale, frightened face in the glass. "Just the wind, Caleb," I'd whisper to the empty room. "Just physics." But physics doesn't explain why the hair on the back of your neck stands up when the wind stops. Physics doesn't explain the feeling of heavy, focused attention. You don't realize how loud your own heartbeat is until it's the only sound for 20 miles. The silence began to change. In the beginning it was peaceful. By the third week it felt predatory. It wasn't that there was no sound. It was that the sounds I expected, the birds, the rustle of deer, seemed to stop abruptly, as if the forest was pausing to listen to me. It was a Tuesday when the first crack in the reality of my isolation appeared. I had hiked down to the storage shed at the base of the tower to grab a fresh propane canister. The ground around the tower was rocky, a mix of granite slab and loose screed dotted with hardy shrubs and pine needles. I knew the terrain. I walked it every day to get to the outhouse. But as I lugged the tank back toward the stairs, I stopped. About 20 feet from the bottom of the stairs, in a small clearing of dirt that I had walked over 100 times, something was wrong. I set the tank down and walked closer. There, arranged on the ground, were stones. These weren't random rocks kicked up by my boots. They were river stones, smooth, gray, rounded stones that didn't belong on this jagged granite peak, and they were arranged in perfect concentric circles. 3 rings spaced exactly 4 inches apart, with a small pile of pine cones stacked in a pyramid in the dead center. I stood there, the wind tugging at my flannel shirt, my brain trying to force the image into a logical box. Hikers know I hadn't seen a soul on the trail in 10 days. The logbook was empty. Ray was 60 miles away at base. Me, did I do this sleepwalking? I knelt down, hovering my hand over the stones without touching them. They were dry. The ground around them was damp from the morning dew, but the stones were bone dry as if they had just been placed there minutes ago. "Hello," I called out. The word hung in the air, pathetic and small. The trees swallowed it instantly. "Is anyone there?" Nothing. Just the swaying of the pines and the distant caw of a raven. I stood up, spinning in a slow circle, scanning the tree line. The forest looked the same as it always did, dense, impenetrable, shadowed. But for the first time, the shadows looked like they had depth, like they were hiding mass and intent. I grabbed a large rock and in a sudden burst of defensive anger, kicked the stone circles apart. I scattered the river stones, sending them clattering into the brush. I kicked the pine cone pyramid until it was just debris. "Stupid," I muttered, my voice shaking. "Just some bored hiker I missed, or some weird surveyor mark." I hauled the propane tank up the 50 feet of stairs, my muscles burning, my adrenaline spiking. When I got inside the cab, I locked the hatch. It was the first time I had locked it during the day. I grabbed the radio. "Base, this is Tomhead. Go for Ray. Ray, have there been any hikers or survey crews scheduled for my sector? Maybe someone coming up the north face? Negative, Caleb. You're the king of the castle up there. Trail count is 0 for the last week. Why are you seeing smoke?" "No smoke. Just thought I saw some trash near the base. Must have been blown in." I lied. Why did I lie? Because saying I found a geometric stone formation that shouldn't exist sounded crazy. It sounded like the isolation psychosis Ray had warned me about. I didn't want to be the city kid who cracked in the first month. "Roger that. Keep it clean. Base out." That night I couldn't sleep. The glass walls, which usually offered a spectacular view of the Milky Way, now felt like an exposure. I lay on my cot, staring at the ceiling, listening to the tower hum. Every time a beam popped or settled, I flinched. I kept thinking about the smooth river stones. The nearest river was 3,000 feet down in the valley. Someone or something had carried them up here. Not 1 or 2, dozens. That's weight. That's effort. That's purpose. The next morning the sun rose blood red through a haze of distant smog from the valley, casting long bruised shadows across the peak. I forced myself to go through the motions: coffee, radio check, binoculars. I stepped out onto the catwalk to take the morning weather reading. The wind was calm, dead calm. The silence was absolute. I looked down at the clearing where I had kicked the stones apart. My coffee cup slipped from my fingers and shattered on the metal grate, sending hot black liquid splashing over my boots. The stones were back. Not just back, they were reassembled. The same 3 concentric circles. The same pyramid of pine cones. But this time the pattern was larger, and there was something new. A line of sharp, jagged sticks had been driven into the ground, radiating out from the outer circle like the rays of a dark sun, and every single stick was pointing directly at the base of the tower stairs. I gripped the railing, my knuckles turning white. The urge to vomit rose in my throat. This wasn't sleepwalking. I hadn't left the tower all night. The hatch was bolted from the inside. Someone had been down there while I slept. Someone had been 40 feet below me, silently arranging stones and sticks while I lay in the dark. I ran back inside and grabbed my high-powered binoculars. I didn't look at the horizon. I looked at the tree line surrounding the base of the peak. I scanned every trunk, every shadow, every bush. There, at the edge of the clearing where the granite gave way to the dense scrub oak, something moved. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, vertical. It stood just behind a large ponderosa pine obscured by the shadows. I focused the lenses, twisting the dial with trembling fingers. The shape was gray and brown, blending perfectly with the bark. It looked like a person wearing a ghillie suit made of dead branches and dried moss. "Hey!" I shouted through the glass, banging my fist against the pane. "I see you! Get the hell out of here!" The figure didn't flinch. It didn't run. It slowly, deliberately stepped back behind the tree and dissolved into the forest. It didn't walk like a hiker. It moved with a fluid sliding motion like oil pouring over rock. I scrambled for the radio. Ray, come in, this is urgent, static." Then, "Tom Head, this is base." "You're coming in hot, Caleb. What's the emergency, y'all?" "There's someone up here, Ray. I saw them. A prowler. They're messing with the site. They built these weird stone circles at the base of the tower." Silence on the line. I waited, my heart slamming against my ribs. "Caleb," Ray's voice was slower now, cautious. "You saw a person—" "Yes, in the tree line, wearing camo or something. They were watching the tower." "Okay, listen to me. Are you locked in?" "Yes. Stay inside. Do not go down. I'm going to call the ranger station, see if they have any patrols in the area. But Caleb, bear hunters use stone markers sometimes. Poachers, too. It's likely just someone trying to spook you or mark a trail." It didn't look like a hunter, Ray. It looked wrong. Define wrong. It moved weird. And the stones, they're river stones, Ray. From the valley bottom. Who hauls 50 pounds of river rocks up a mountain to mark a trail? Ray didn't answer immediately. The dead air stretched out thick and heavy. "Sit tight, kid. I'll get a ranger up there. Might take a day or two. Resources are thin with the fires down south. Just keep your head on a swivel and keep that door locked." "Copy." I spent the rest of the day holding a flare gun, my only weapon, sitting in the center of the room. I didn't read. I didn't cook. I just watched the tree line. The sun moved across the sky agonizingly slow. Every shifting shadow looked like the figure. Every rustle of the wind sounded like footsteps on the stairs. The glass walls were meant to let me see out, but at night they only served to let everything else see in. As dusk fell, the interior of the cab reflected in the glass, turning the windows into mirrors. I couldn't see out anymore. I could only see myself pale and sweating, holding a flare gun, trapped in a box of light, suspended in a void of darkness. I turned off the lantern. I sat in the dark. It was the only way to see what was coming. Around midnight, the wind died completely. The silence returned heavier than before. Then I heard it. Scrape. It came from below. The sound of something hard dragging across the metal of the stairs. I froze, breath hitched in my throat. Scrape. Thud. A footstep. Someone was on the stairs. Scrape. Thud. They were climbing. Slowly. Deliberately, not the quick, rhythmic clatter of a ranger or a hiker. This was heavy, dragging steps. I crawled to the hatch in the floor, pressing my ear against the heavy wood. I could hear the vibrations traveling up the steel structure. Clang. They hit the first landing, 20 feet up. I gripped the flare gun with both hands, aiming it at the hatch. My hands were shaking so bad I thought I might drop it. "Go away!" I screamed, my voice cracking. "I'm armed. I'm radioing the police." The footsteps stopped. Silence. Absolute terrifying silence. I waited. 1 minute, 5 minutes, 10. Had they gone down? Had they frozen? Then a sound came that made my blood turn to ice. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't a threat. It was a mimicry. From just beneath the floorboards, right under my feet, a sound drifted up. Hoo-wee, hoo-wee. The exact same two-note whistle the wind made. But there was no wind. It was wet, guttural, coming from a throat that sounded filled with fluid. I dry-fired the trigger of the flare gun in my mind 1,000 times, but my finger wouldn't move. Then the footsteps started again. But they weren't going up. They were going down. Scrape, thud, scrape, thud. descending. I listened until the sounds faded into the dirt below. I didn't sleep. I sat over the hatch gun pointed, waiting for the sun. When dawn finally broke gray and overcast, I forced myself to open the hatch and look down. The stairs were empty, but on the metal landing 20 feet up, there was something left behind. I grabbed my binoculars and looked down through the grating. It was a bundle, a small, messy bundle wrapped in what looked like dirty flannel. Against every instinct screaming at me to stay inside, I had to know. I climbed down, one hand on the railing, one hand on the flare gun. I reached the landing. The bundle wasn't wrapped in flannel. It was flannel, a piece of torn shirt. I picked it up. It was heavy. I unfolded the cloth. Inside was a dead bird, a Steller's jay, its neck broken at an unnatural angle. But it wasn't the bird that made me drop the bundle and scramble back up the stairs on all fours like a panicked animal. It was the cloth. It was a square of red and black plaid flannel, faded, ripped. I looked down at my own shirt. My chest heaved. I was wearing a blue denim work shirt, but in my pack I had a red and black flannel shirt. I scrambled into the cab, tearing my backpack open, dumping the contents onto the floor. Canned beans, socks, books, first aid kit. My red flannel shirt was gone. I hadn't lost it. I hadn't dropped it. It had been inside the cab, inside the tower. Someone hadn't just climbed the stairs last night. Someone had been inside the room with me before I locked the door. Or worse, they had a way in that I didn't know about. I stood in the center of the room, spinning around, checking the windows, the hatch, the vents. Everything was sealed, but the shirt was gone, and a piece of it had just been hand-delivered back to me wrapped around a broken offering. I grabbed the radio, screaming into the handset. Ray, they were inside. They stole my clothes. Get me out of here. Send the police." Static. Just static. Then a click. The static cut out. "Ray?" Nothing. I checked the power light. Green. The radio was on. "Base anyone." I followed the cord from the handset to the radio unit. It was plugged in. Then I looked at the wall where the antenna cable ran out through the conduit to the roof. The cable wasn't connected. It had been sliced, cleanly, not chewed by rats. Cut with a blade. The end of the cable lay on the table, and next to it, scratched into the wood of the table, deep, jagged letters that looked like they were carved with a fingernail, was a single word: watching. I wasn't the watcher anymore. I was the exhibit, and the glass walls of Tom Head weren't there to protect me from the elements. They were there to keep me fresh. The panic that hit me then was primal. It wasn't the intellectual fear of the stone circles. It was the physical terror of a trapped animal. I looked at the door. I could run. I could pack my bag and run down the trail. But then I looked out the window. At the edge of the clearing, standing fully in the open now, was the figure. And next to it was another one, and another, 3 of them, standing still, made of roots and rot and stolen clothes. They weren't moving. They were just waiting. And in the hand of the middle one, dangling by a sleeve, was the rest of my red flannel shirt. I wasn't going anywhere. The trail was theirs. The woods were theirs. My world had shrunk to 14 feet square. I locked the hatch again, dragging the heavy table over it. I sat in the corner with the flare gun. Isolation doesn't heal you. It just amplifies the noise in your head until the screaming starts. And as I watched the 3 figures below begin to slowly, methodically gather wood, I knew the screaming was about to get very, very loud. The morning sun didn't bring relief. It brought clarity, and clarity is a cruel thing when you're living in a nightmare. The 3 figures that had stood at the tree-lined, silent sentinels of the dark had vanished with the dawn melting back into the shadows of the ponderosa pines, as if they were made of the same vapor as the morning mist. But they had left a residue of fear that clung to the inside of the glass cabin like cigarette smoke. I was still huddled in the corner, the flare gun heavy and cold in my cramping hand, staring at the empty clearing. The world looked deceptively normal. The sky was a piercing, innocent blue. A hawk circled lazily on a thermal updraft. If you took a photograph, it would look like paradise. But I knew the truth. The landscape was no longer a view. It was a camouflage. My first instinct was to run. Just pack the bag, leave the heavy gear, and sprint down the trail until my lungs burned and I hit pavement. But panic sharp as it was, had a dull, counterweight logic. The trail was 5 miles of switchbacks through dense, overgrown forest. If they, whoever they were watching the tower, they were watching the trail. Being in the tower meant I was trapped, yes, but I was trapped in a fortress with 360-degree visibility. Being on the trail meant being blind, exposed, and slow. I chose the cage over the coffin. My second priority was the radio. I crawled out from under the table, my joints popping, and approached the severed cable. The clean cut was a mockery, a surgical incision in my lifeline. I spent the next 3 hours in a fever state of delicate, trembling engineering. I stripped the plastic casing with my pocket knife, exposing the copper veins. My hand shook so badly I sliced my thumb, dripping bright red blood onto the wooden floorboards, a stark contrast to the gray dust. I twisted the wires back together, wrapping them in electrical tape I found in the emergency kit. It was an ugly bulbous knot of a repair, but when I flipped the switch, the static didn't just hiss, it roared. "Mayday, mayday. Base, this is Tom Head. Ray, do you copy over?" I waited. The static crackled, popping like frying bacon. "Ray, emergency traffic. I have intruders at the tower." A burst of white noise and then a voice, faint swimming through an ocean of interference, but there. "Tom Head. Copy. Broken signal. Say again. Intruders. People in the woods. They cut the line. I need extraction." "Caleb, calm down. You're breaking up. Sounds like wind damage." "Did you say cut?" "Yes, cut intentional. Get the sheriff." "Listen, patrol, 2 days out. Fire near Yola Bali. Resources diverted. Sit tight. Lock the..." The signal washed out into a high-pitched squeal before settling back into a rhythmic thrum. I threw the handset against the map table. He didn't understand. He thought it was stress. He thought it was wind. 2 days! He might as well have said 2 centuries. The isolation shifted gears then. It wasn't just physical anymore, it was existential. I was the only person on Earth who knew I was in danger. That knowledge sat in my gut like a stone. I spent the rest of the day fortifying. I nailed spare planks over the hatch. I sharpened a broom handle into a crude spear. I was a castaway on an island of granite preparing for a siege against ghosts. But ghosts don't leave physical evidence. And that afternoon, driven by a morbid, self-destructive curiosity, I decided I needed to know what I was fighting. I needed to see where they had stood. I unlocked the hatch, the sound of the deadbolt sliding back echoing like a gunshot, and crept down the stairs. The air at the base of the tower was still smelling of hot pine needles and dry earth. I walked to the edge of the clearing to the spot where the middle figure had stood holding my shirt. The ground was disturbed. Not by footprints, the soil was swept clean, unnaturally smooth, as if someone had used a brush to erase their tracks. But stuck into the dirt, arranged in a perfect triangle, were 3 bundles of sage bound with human hair. Long black strands of hair that glistened with grease. I stepped back, my boot crunching on something brittle. I looked down. It was a jawbone. Small. A deer. A coyote. It was stripped clean, bleached white by the sun, and carved. Intricate, microscopic geometric patterns had been etched into the bone. Spirals, triangles, eyes. I kicked it away, a revulsion rising in my throat that tasted like bile. This wasn't poachers. Poachers don't carve scrimshaw into roadkill. This was ritual. The next 48 hours were a blur of sleep deprivation and caffeine. I didn't sleep at night. I slept in 20-minute bursts during the high noon sun when the shadows were shortest. I watched the woods until my eyes watered and stung. I saw movement constantly, flashes of flannel, the glint of metal, but every time I focused the binoculars, it was just a branch of rock, a trick of the light. The forest was gaslighting me. On the 3rd day, the wind changed direction. It started blowing up from the canyon, carrying the scent of the deep woods, rotting vegetation, stagnant water, and something else, a sweet, cloying smell like spoiled meat disguised with perfume. I grabbed the binoculars and followed the scent trail with my eyes. Down the ridge, about 300 yards from the tower, in a dense thicket of manzanita that I had never paid attention to, there was a patch of color that didn't belong. A splash of artificial red against the organic green. I shouldn't have gone down. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to stay in the tower. But the waiting was worse than the knowing. The ambiguity was eating my mind faster than the fear. I took the flare gun, my knife, and the radio, which was receiving but not transmitting well, and I descended. The hike down the scree slope was treacherous. Loose rocks skittered under my boots, tumbling down into the abyss. I reached the tree line and pushed into the brush. The manzanita was thick, their smooth red branches twisting like muscular arteries, snagging my clothes, scratching my face. The smell got stronger. It was suffocating now. I broke through the thicket into a small hidden clearing, a natural cul-de-sac formed by a circle of ancient oaks. The light here was dim, filtered through the heavy canopy, turning the air a sickly greenish hue, and there, standing in the center of the clearing, was the effigy. It was hideous, a mockery of the human form that hit me with the force of a physical blow. It stood about 6 feet tall, supported by a central spine of a sapling that had been violently bent and lashed into an upright position. The body was a chaotic, tangled mass of roots, thick, gnarled roots that looked like exposed intestines woven together with rusted barbed wire. The wire bit into the wood, staining the roots with streaks of orange oxidation that looked like dried blood. But it was the head that made my knees weak. It was a burlap sack stained dark with grease, stuffed with dry grass to form a bulbous, misshapen cranium. And stitched onto the front of the burlap using thick black fishing line were features, 2 eyes. One was a button, a simple white plastic button from a shirt. The other was organic. It was dried, shriveled, a clouded, yellowed marble that used to be an animal's eye, and below them a mouth, a slit cut into the fabric, pulled wide and stitched open in a permanent silent scream. Inside the slit someone had jammed teeth, real teeth, molars, incisors, yellow and cracked, embedded in the straw. I stood frozen, the silence of the grove pressing against my eardrums. The effigy wasn't just a scarecrow, it was a portrait. It was wearing a belt, my belt, the leather belt I had lost or thought I had lost 2 weeks ago. It was buckled tight around the waist of roots, cinching the chaotic mass into a grotesque, hourglass shape. "You sick freaks," I whispered. The sound of my own voice startled a fly that was buzzing around the mouth of the thing. It was an effigy of me, the height, the posture, the belt. It was me, stripped of humanity, reconstructed out of garbage and pain. Rage, hot and blinding, overtook the fear. This was personal. This was a violation. I didn't care about the ritual. I didn't care about the spirits. I wanted to destroy it. I wanted to hurt the thing that was mocking me. I lunged forward, tackling the wooden monstrosity. It was heavier than it looked, solid and dense. We crashed to the ground, the barbed wire tearing at my jacket, the smell of rot exploding into the air. I straddled the chest of the figure, screaming a guttural, wordless war cry, and began to tear it apart. I ripped the burlap head off. Dust and dead beetles spilled out. I smashed the root rib cage with my boot. Snap, crack. The sound of dry wood breaking was incredibly loud, like gunshots in the quiet grove. I stomped on the teeth, grinding them into the dirt. I pulled the barbed wire until it sliced my palms, uncoiling the metal snake and flinging it into the bushes. I didn't stop until the effigy was nothing but a pile of kindling. Just trash. Just sticks and wire. "I'm still here," I screamed at the trees, panting sweat stinging my eyes. "I'm still here, is that the best you got?" The forest didn't answer. The trees just swayed gently, their leaves rustling with a sound like 1,000 dry hands rubbing together. I spat on the pile of debris and turned back toward the tower. I felt a surge of adrenaline, a manic triumph. I had faced the monster and I had broken it. I was in control. I was wrong. That night the wind howled. It was a gale-force storm that battered the tower, shaking the steel legs until the whole structure vibrated. I sat in the dark, drinking whiskey from a flask I had hidden in my pack, feeling the false bravery of the alcohol warming my blood. I had won. I had destroyed their totem. They would know I wasn't prey. I fell into a fitful, drunken sleep around 3:00 a.m., dreaming of teeth. Thousands of teeth growing out of the floorboards, chattering in unison. I woke up to silence. The storm had passed. The morning light was gray and flat, filtering through the high clouds. My head throbbed with a hangover, a dull ache behind my eyes. I sat up, rubbing my face, and looked out the window toward the north, toward the ridge where the clearing was. My heart stopped. It didn't just skip a beat. It fully arrested in my chest, a cold void opening up in my rib cage. The effigy was back. But it wasn't in the clearing down the ridge. It was standing at the edge of the tower shadow, 50 yards away, and it wasn't rebuilt. It was healed. I grabbed the binoculars, my hands shaking so hard. I slammed the lenses against the glass. I focused. It was the same effigy, the same burlap head, the same button eye, the same animal eye, the same belt, but the roots weren't tied together with wire anymore. They were woven, seamlessly, as if they had grown that way overnight. The wood wasn't dry and brittle. It looked slick, wet, alive. The breaks I had made, the shattered ribs, were gone. The form was smoother, more muscular, more human in its proportions. And it was looking up, not vaguely toward the tower. It was looking directly at me. The head was tilted back at an impossible angle, the neck stretched unnaturally long, the stitched mouth aiming its silent scream right at my window. "No," I whispered, backing away until my back hit the map table. "No, no, no, I broke you. I killed you." I grabbed the radio. Ray, pick up, it's back, the thing is back, static." And then a sound that made me drop the handset. Through the speaker, cutting through the white noise, came a sound. Crunch, snap, crunch. The sound of wood breaking. The sound I had made yesterday when I destroyed the figure. Played back to me. Looped, crunch, snap. They had recorded me. Or the radio was replaying my memories. I ripped the battery pack out of the radio, hurling it across the room. I looked down again. The effigy had moved. In the 10 seconds I had turned away, it had moved 10 yards closer. It didn't walk. There were no footprints. It just displaced. It existed at point A, and then it existed at point B. It was coming to the stairs. I needed fire. Fire cleanses. Fire destroys what force cannot. I grabbed the remaining propane canister for the stove. I grabbed a lighter. I grabbed the flare gun. "You want to play?" I hissed, my voice trembling with the onset of hysteria. "Let's play." I ran onto the catwalk. The wind whipped my hair into my face. "Hey!" I screamed down. "Hey, you ugly bastard!" The effigy stood at the base of the rocky incline leading to the tower legs. It was motionless. Up close from this angle I could see the animal eye glistening. It looked wet. It was looking at me. I aimed the flare gun. It was a long shot, 40 yards wind variable. I didn't care. I pulled the trigger. Thump whoosh. The red phosphorus flare arced through the gray morning air, leaving a trail of smoke. It spiraled down, missing the effigy by 3 feet, landing in the dry brush next to it. Damn it. But the brush was dry. Tinder dry. The flare sputtered, hissing, glowing with an intense magnesium heat. The dry grass caught instantly. Flames licked up orange and hungry. The fire spread to the manzanita bush next to the figure. The effigy didn't move. It stood in the rising flames, the fire climbing up its root legs. I watched, mesmerized, as the fire consumed it. The burlap head caught the grease, acting as an accelerant. Black smoke billowed up. The stitched mouth seemed to widen as the fabric burned away. It didn't fall. It didn't crumble. It stood upright in the center of the inferno, burning like a martyr. As the flames engulfed it completely, I heard a sound, not from the fire, from the figure, a high-pitched tea kettle shriek. The sound of escaping gas from green wood, or a scream. It burned until it was nothing but a charred skeleton of carbon collapsing into a heap of ash. I slumped against the railing laughing, a jagged, broken laugh that hurt my chest. "Burn," I choked out. "Burn." I stayed on the catwalk until the fire died down, stomping out the embers that drifted too close to the tower legs. I had started a fire in a national forest. That was a felony. I didn't care. I had killed the monster. Again. Around noon, the sound of an engine cut through the silence. A truck, a white Forest Service pickup truck dusting up the road. Rescue. I waved my arm, shouting, tears streaming down my face. "Here, up here." The truck parked at the turnaround. A figure stepped out, green uniform, flat-brimmed hat. It wasn't Ray. It was a woman. Tall, severe moving, with a stiff, formal gait. I ran down the stairs to meet her, my ankle throbbing, my face smeared with soot and sweat. "Thank God," I gasped, reaching the bottom. "Thank God you're here. You have to get me out. There are people. Cultists. I had to burn it. They built a—" The ranger held up a hand. A gloved hand. She didn't smile. She didn't look concerned. Her face was blank, her skin pale and waxy, her eyes hidden behind mirrored aviator sunglasses. "Name?" she asked. Her voice was flat, monotone, not bored, just devoid of inflection. Caleb Miller. Look, did Ray send you my radio? Is—" "Ranger Elena," she said, cutting me off. She looked past me toward the pile of ash where the effigy had stood. "You started a fire, Caleb." "It was self-defense. There was a thing, a scarecrow. It moved. I know how it sounds, but it moved." Elena walked past me, her boots making no sound on the gravel. She approached the ash pile. She crouched down, picking up a handful of soot. She rubbed it between her gloved fingers. "You shouldn't have burned it," she said softly. "It was threatening me." She stood up and turned to face me. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were the wrong color. They were gray. Not blue-gray or slate-gray. They were the flat, dead gray of river stones, and the pupils were pinpricks too small for the dim light. "It wasn't threatening you, Caleb," she said. "It was an anchor, a vessel." "A vessel for what?" I backed away, my hand drifting to the knife on my belt. "For the things that are too big to walk in this world without a skin," she said. She looked up at the tower. "You destroyed the vessel. Now the passenger has nowhere to go except up." "What are you talking about? Who are you?" "Ray didn't send me," she said, answering a question I hadn't asked yet. "Ray is in the valley. Ray thinks you're having a breakdown. Maybe you are." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a notebook. She ripped out a page and handed it to me. "This is a warning. Official notice." I took the paper. My hands were shaking. It was blank. "It's empty," I said, looking up. "No," Elena said. "It's not empty. It's waiting." She walked back to her truck. She moved with a fluid, sliding motion that triggered a memory in the lizard part of my brain, oil pouring over rock. "Wait," I shouted. "You can't leave me here. Take me down." She opened the driver's side door and looked back. "I can't take you, Caleb. You've been marked. If I take you down, they follow. And I have a family." "Who follows the people in the woods?" Elena smiled. It was a tight, skin-stretching smile that showed too many teeth. "There are no people in these woods, Caleb. There haven't been since the landslide of '94. You're the only warm blood on this mountain." "Then who built the effigy?" I screamed. "The mountain built it," she said, "to talk to you, and you burned the messenger." She got in the truck. The engine roared to life. "Lock your door tonight, Caleb," she called out over the engine, "and cover the mirrors. They hate their own reflection." She drove away. I watched the dust cloud settle. I looked down at the paper in my hand. It wasn't blank anymore. Slowly, as if written by invisible ink reacting to the heat of my hand, words were appearing. Scrawled in charcoal, "Invitation accepted." I dropped the paper and ran. I ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, tripping, scrambling, tearing my nails on the grating. I reached the cab and slammed the hatch. I threw the bolt. I dragged the heavy cot over the door. I dragged the table. I piled the books. I sat in the center of the room, clutching the flare gun, hyperventilating. Invitation accepted. I had burned the vessel. I had released the smoke, and smoke rises. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. The tower began to cool. And then the sound started. Not the wind, not the whistle. It was a scratching. Soft at first, like a mouse. Scritch, scritch. It was coming from the glass. I looked up. The windows were 12 feet high. There was no catwalk on the outside of the glass. Just a sheer drop. Scritch. A long, thin scratch appeared on the outside of the pane facing the north ridge. Then another. Vertical, parallel. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. Something was outside. Hovering, or climbing the smooth glass like a fly. I forced myself to stand up, to look. The sun dipped below the horizon, and for a split second the twilight illuminated the silhouette pressed against the glass. It wasn't a person. It wasn't the effigy. It was a shadow with mass, a shadow that blocked the stars. And then a face pressed against the glass. It was my face but melting. My face constructed of smoke and ash and charcoal smear. The mouth of the smoke face opened, and through the inch-thick safety glass I heard it whisper, "Let us in!" I backed away, stumbling over the map pedestal. The glass pane shuddered. The steel frame groaned. "You're not real," I sobbed. "Your stress, your isolation." The face smiled. The smoke swirled, forming words on the glass written in the condensation of its own breath. "We are the ash." Then the scratching stopped. The face dissolved. But I wasn't relieved, because I heard a new sound. The sound of the lock on the hatch below the pile of furniture. Click. The deadbolt sliding back. I had the key. The only key was in my pocket. Click. The handle turned. The cot lifted an inch as the door pushed up against the barricade. I aimed the flare gun at the floor. "Come on!" I screamed. "Come on!" But the door stopped pushing. Silence returned. Then the broken radio with the missing battery, cracked to life. The green power light flickered on. "Caleb," Ray's voice said. Clear, calm. "Caleb, are you there? Ray, help me. It's in the tower." Caleb Ray's voice continued, but the tone was wrong. It was too flat, too rhythmic. "Open the hatch, Caleb. It's stuffy in there. We need to breathe." "That's not Ray," I whispered. "Open the hatch, Caleb," the voice on the radio repeated louder now. "Open the hatch. Open the hatch." The voice began to layer. Ray's voice, my voice, Elena's voice, a chorus of the dead and the missing. "Open the hatch." I grabbed the radio and smashed it against the wall. It shattered, but the voice didn't stop. It just moved. It was coming from the walls now, from the floorboards, from the humming tension rods of the tower. The whole tower was speaking. "Open the hatch." I curled into a ball in the center of the room, covering my ears. I knew then that the effigy wasn't the monster. The effigy was the leash. It was the physical cage that kept the spirit bound to the earth. By burning it, I hadn't destroyed the enemy. I had freed it. I had turned a solid thing into a gas, and gas can go anywhere. It can seep through cracks. It can enter lungs. I looked at the vent near the floor. A wisp of black smoke was curling in. It wasn't smoke from a fire. It moved with intent. It swirled like a snake tasting the air. It was coming inside. And I had nowhere left to go but down. I scrambled to my feet. The hatch was barricaded. The smoke was pouring in faster now, pooling on the floor like black water. I looked at the windows. They were my only exit. I grabbed the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove. I swung it with everything I had at the north-facing pane. Smash! The safety glass spider-webbed but didn't break. The smoke rose to my knees. It was cold, freezing cold. Where it touched my skin, it felt like liquid nitrogen. Smash! A hole opened in the glass. The wind howled in. I cleared the shards with the pan. I looked down, 50 feet to the dark, jagged rocks below. Behind me, the room was filling with the black fog. Forms were rising from it. Hands, faces. I climbed onto the sill. The wind tried to push me back in. "You don't get me," I said to the darkness. "You don't get the skin." I looked at the drop. It was suicide. Or it was survival. The smoke grabbed my ankle. It felt like a cold, wet hand. I didn't think. I kicked free and pushed off. For a second I was flying, then gravity took over. The fall was silent. The impact was the loudest sound I had ever heard. And as the darkness of unconsciousness rose up to meet me, I saw one last thing. Standing at the top of the tower, looking down at me through the broken window, was Caleb. Another Caleb. Wearing my red flannel shirt. He waved. And then the lights went out. Pain has a flavor. It tastes like copper pennies and sour bile. It has a sound, too, a high-pitched screaming tinnitus that drowns out the wind and the world. I didn't wake up. I came back into existence in shards. The first thing I knew was the cold, the kind of cold that doesn't just sit on your skin but burrows into your marrow and sets up camp. I was lying on my side, half wedged between two granite boulders at the base of the scree slope. Above me the tower loomed a black silhouette, cutting a jagged hole in the star-speckled sky. The window I had smashed was a dark, jagged mouth breathing smoke into the night. I tried to move and the world dissolved into white light. A scream tore out of my throat, but it came out as a wet, ragged gasp. My right leg was wrong. That was the only word for it. It was bent at an angle that anatomy books don't have pages for. The boot was still on, but the ankle inside felt like a bag of gravel. I bit down on my tongue until I tasted blood, using the sharp, stinging pain in my mouth to distract from the agonizing, grinding ruin of my leg. I was alive. Somehow the slope had broken my fall, tumbling me down through the brush and loose rock battering me but not killing me. But I was broken. I was prey. I lay there for what felt like hours listening. The wind had died. The forest was holding its breath again, but it wasn't empty. Above me in the tower, the light from the stove or the fire I had started earlier cast a flickering, sickly orange glow. And in the window I saw him, the other Caleb, the silhouette wearing my flannel shirt. He wasn't waving anymore. He was standing perfectly still, hands pressed against the glass, looking down. He knew where I was. He was watching me bleed. Then the smell hit me. Not the ozone smell of the smoke entity. This was earthy, gasoline, sulfur, unwashed bodies. I dragged myself backward, clawing at the dirt with my fingernails, pulling my broken body deeper into the shadow of the boulders. Every inch of movement sent shockwaves of nausea through my gut. I wedged myself into a crevice, pulling a dead manzanita bush over my legs to hide the white gleam of my exposed sock. Footsteps, not the scraping, heavy drag of the entity. These were rhythmic. Boots on gravel. Many boots. They didn't come from the trail. They emerged from the tree line, stepping out of the darkness, as if the night itself was birthing them. 1, 2, 5, 10, 12 of them. They moved in perfect unison, a silent phalanx of shadows. They weren't wearing robes or cult markings. They were dressed in ordinary clothes, faded denim Carhartt jackets, woolen caps. They looked like locals, like the people you see buying cigarettes at the gas station in the valley or drinking cheap beer in the bed of a pickup truck. But their movements were wrong. There was no hesitation, no individual variance. They walked with a stiff, synchronized gait, their arms hanging limp at their sides, and they were all humming, a low, vibrating thrum that resonated in my chest. It wasn't a melody. It was a frequency, a dissonant grinding chord that made my teeth ache. I pressed my hand over my mouth, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. Were they here to help? Had they seen the fire? Help! I tried to whisper. But then the leader stepped into the patch of moonlight near the base of the tower legs. He was wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit stained with grease, but where his face should have been there was bark. It wasn't a mask tied on with string. It looked fused. A slab of rough gray pine bark covered his entire facial structure, curving around his jaw. There were no eye holes, no mouth hole, just the raw, textured surface of a tree. He raised a hand. The humming stopped instantly. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound. The leader tilted his head back, aiming the bark face toward the top of the tower, toward the imposter. He didn't speak. He clicked, a sound like two stones striking together. Clack! The other 11 figures moved. They didn't rush. They fanned out, encircling the 4 steel legs of the tower. They moved with the efficiency of a demolition crew. From beneath their coats, they pulled jugs, plastic milk jugs, metal jerry cans. They began to pour. The smell of gasoline grew overpowering, stinging my eyes. They doused the wooden cross braces. They splashed fuel on the dry brush underneath the structure. They were building a pyre. My mind raced, trying to bridge the gap between the supernatural horror in the tower and the physical threat on the ground. Were they attacking the entity, or were they feeding it? The leader, the Barkman, walked to the center of the structure, directly underneath the trap door. He stood in the puddle of gasoline. He didn't seem to care. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a flare, not a gun, a road flare. He struck it. The red light hissed into existence, bathing the scene in a bloody, hellish glow. It illuminated the faces of the others. They didn't have masks. They had nothing. Their faces were smooth, blank flesh, no eyes, no noses, no mouths. Just skin stretched tight over bone like thumbprints on wet clay. I gagged, burying my face in the dirt to stifle the sound. These weren't locals. These were the ash walkers Elena had warned about. The things that are too big to walk in this world without a skin. They had stolen skins, but they couldn't get the details right. "Prophet!" A voice boomed from above. My blood froze. The voice came from the tower. It was the imposter, the fake Caleb. "Prophet!" the imposter screamed again. The voice was distorted, amplified, as if the glass cabin was a giant speaker. "You are late. The vessel is broken." The Barkman didn't look up. He held the flare steady. "The vessel is flawed," the Barkman replied. His voice didn't come from a mouth. It came from everywhere. It was the sound of grinding wood. The vessel rejected the seed. It must be cleansed. "I am the seed," the imposter shrieked. "I am wearing the memory. I am the watcher now." "You are merely the echo," the Barkman said. "The flesh is down there." He turned. The slab of bark rotated. He wasn't looking at the tower anymore. He was looking at the rocks, at me. He couldn't see me. He had no eyes. But he knew. "Bring him," the Barkman said. 2 of the blank-faced figures broke from the circle. They turned toward my hiding spot. Panic, sharp and electric, overrode the pain. I couldn't fight. I couldn't run. I was a rat in a trap. I looked around for a weapon, a rock, a stick. My hand closed around a sharp piece of granite. It was pathetic. It was nothing. The figures approached. They moved silently, stepping over the brush. "Stay back!" I screamed, abandoning stealth. I hurled the rock. It struck the chest of the first figure. It didn't flinch. It didn't make a sound. It just kept coming. They reached me. Hands cold as ice and hard as iron clamped onto my jacket. They didn't grab my arms. They grabbed the fabric, the flesh, lifting me like a rag doll. I kicked out with my good leg connecting with a knee. It felt like kicking a tree trunk. "Let me go, God help me, let me go." They dragged me out of the shadows. My broken ankle dragged over the rock, sending white-hot spikes of agony shooting up my spine. I screamed until my throat tore, but the sound was swallowed by the vast, indifferent night. They threw me into the circle right at the feet of the Barkman. The smell of gasoline was suffocating. I lay on my back, looking up at the monster. The red light of the flare reflected off the sap leaking from the cracks in his bark face. "Caleb Miller," the Barkman ground out. "You interrupted the gestation." "I didn't do anything," I sobbed, clutching my leg. "I just wanted a job. I just wanted to be alone." "Solitude is a door," the Barkman said. "You opened it, but you refused to walk through. You burned the invitation." He pointed the flare at me. The heat radiated against my face. "Now you are the fuel." "Wait," I shouted. "Wait, the thing in the tower? It looks like me. Take it. Take that one." The Barkman paused. He tilted his head. "The thing in the tower," he said slowly, "is your refusal. It is the part of you that wanted to stay, the part that fell in love with the silence. We harvested it. But it is hollow. It has no fear, and fear is the binding agent." He looked up at the tower. The imposter was pressing its face against the glass, banging on the pane. It looked terrified now. It looked exactly like me. "The cycle requires three," the barkman intoned. "The observer, the effigy, and the fire." He looked back down at me. "You are the observer. That," he pointed to the tower, "is the effigy. And this," he dropped the flare. It fell in slow motion, a sputtering red star falling into a black sea of gasoline. Whoosh! The world turned orange. The heat was instantaneous and crushing. The air was sucked out of the clearing to feed the sudden inferno. The flames leaped up the legs of the tower, racing toward the cab like climbing vines of light. I scrambled backward, crab-walking on my hands and one good leg shielding my face from the blistering heat. The blank-faced figures didn't move. They stood in the fire. They let the flames lick their clothes, their skin. They didn't burn. They absorbed the light, their outlines wavering like mirages. Above me the tower began to scream, not the metal, the entity. The imposter in the cab was shrieking a sound that shifted rapidly from human to animal to mechanical. I watched as the flames reached the underside of the cab. The floorboards caught. The structure groaned, the steel softening under the intensity of the heat. The imposter ran to the broken window. "Don't let me die!" it screamed, looking down at me. "I am you! I am you! You're not me!" I yelled back, the heat searing my eyebrows. "Burn! Go back to hell and burn!" The barkman stepped toward me through the wall of fire. He was untouched. "He is not you," the barkman agreed. "He is what you left behind, and now you must leave the rest." He reached down. His hand, rough wood and strong, grabbed my collar. He hauled me up. My broken leg dangled uselessly. The pain was distant now, masked by the sheer terror of the moment. "Watch," he commanded. "The observer must watch until the end." He forced my head up. The tower was a torch. The glass windows exploded outward, showering the clearing with shards that glittered like diamonds in the firelight. The imposter was burning, but it didn't turn to ash. As the flannel shirt burned away and the skin peeled back, there was no meat underneath. There was no bone. Underneath the skin of the fake Caleb there was light, blinding white-hot light. The entity was shedding its disguise. It was a being of pure energy trapped in a cage of physical matter, and the fire was stripping the cage away. It rose up, expanding, growing larger than the tower itself, a pillar of white light shooting into the night sky, piercing the clouds. The sound changed. The screaming stopped. It was replaced by a low resonant thrum, the same hum the figures had made but magnified 1,000 times. It vibrated my teeth. It vibrated the rocks. "Beautiful," the barkman whispered. "What is it?" I gasped. "The signal," he said. "Tomhead is not a lookout for fires, Caleb. It is a transmitter, and you just powered it on." The pillar of light pulsed once, sending a shock wave through the forest that knocked the tops off the pine trees. Then it collapsed. It didn't fade. It slammed back down into the earth, right through the ruins of the tower, driving into the bedrock. The ground shook, a localized earthquake. The burning tower legs buckled. With a groan of twisting steel, the 50-foot structure collapsed. It fell in slow motion, crashing down onto the rocky slope, sending a geyser of sparks and debris into the air. The impact threw me and the barkman backward. I hit the ground hard, rolling away from the heat. Silence returned. The fire was still raging in the wreckage, but the supernatural energy was gone. The white light had vanished into the earth. I lay on my back, coughing, my lungs filled with smoke. The figures were gone. The 12 blank-faced men, the barkman. Vanished. Just like the entity in the tower. I was alone with the fire. No, not alone. I heard a radio, not my radio, a truck radio. "Dispatch to Unit 4. We have a visual on a large structure fire at Tomhead Peak. Over." "Unit 4, copy. We are 10 mics out. It looks massive. Roll fire and rescue." The voices were coming from the service road. I turned my head. Headlights. Real yellow halogen headlights cutting through the smoke. The sheriff, the rangers, the real world was crashing back in. I tried to crawl toward the lights. "Here," I croaked. "I'm here." But then I saw it, lying next to me where the barkman had stood. It was a mask. A piece of gray pine bark curved to fit a human face, and next to it, a name tag. A plastic pin name tag, scorched but readable. It said Ray. I stared at the name tag. Ray, my supervisor. The voice on the radio. The man who told me to stay calm. The man who told me it was just stress. Ray wasn't in the valley. Ray wasn't at base. Ray had been the one wearing the bark. Or the thing wearing the bark had been Ray. The realization hit me harder than the fall. The isolation hadn't been an accident. The job wasn't a job, it was a setup. They needed someone up here, someone isolated, someone desperate, someone to build the energy, to feed the fear, to act as the catalyst for whatever that pillar of light was. They needed a battery, and I was it. The headlights swept over me, doors slammed. "I see a survivor," a voice shouted. "Get the medic!" Boots crunched on the gravel. Real boots. Hands touched me, warm human hands. "It's okay, son. We got you. You're safe now." I looked up into the face of a young deputy. He looked terrified by the sight of my leg, by the blood, by the soot. "They're gone," I whispered, grabbing his uniform with a desperate grip. "Check the woods. They're watching." "Who's watching?" the deputy asked, glancing around nervously. "The ash walkers," I said. "And Ray. Find Ray." The deputy looked back at his partner. "He's in shock. Get the stretcher." They loaded me up. The pain of moving my leg finally did what the fall couldn't. It pushed me into the darkness. But as I blacked out, I heard one last thing. Not from the deputies, not from the fire, from the pocket of my own jacket. My handheld radio, which I thought was broken. It crackled to life. "Good work, Caleb," Ray's voice said. "Clear, close. The transmission was received. We'll be in touch." The hospital was bright. Too bright. Fluorescent lights that buzzed with a frequency that reminded me of the tower. I spent 3 weeks in traction, reconstructive surgery on the ankle, skin grafts for the burns on my hands. The police came, the sheriff, a federal agent from the Forest Service. They asked questions. I gave answers. There were 12 men, I said. They had no faces. The leader had a bark mask. His name tag said Ray. The sheriff sighed, exchanging a look with the Fed. "Caleb," the sheriff said gently. "We found the name tag. It was yours. It said Caleb. You were holding it when we found you." "No," I said. "It said Ray." "Ray doesn't exist, Caleb," the Fed said, opening a file. "We checked the logs. There is no Ray at the base station. The tower at Tom Head has been automated for 5 years. You were there as a caretaker, not a lookout. You were reporting to a computer system." "I talked to him," I shouted. "Every day he told me about the weather." "He told me about the bear hunters." Audio hallucinations, the doctor interjected from the corner. Classic symptom of isolation stress. Your mind created a companion. And when the stress became too much, the companion became the antagonist. "And the fire?" I asked. "The figures, the pillar of light." "You set the fire, Caleb," the sheriff said. "We found the accelerant on your clothes. You burned the tower down. We're not pressing charges because, well, given your mental state." They showed me photos of the wreckage, photos of me being loaded into the ambulance. There was no bark man, no blank-faced figures, just me alone in the dirt surrounded by a ring of scorched earth. I stopped arguing. I realized then that truth is a democracy. If everyone agrees you're crazy, then you're crazy. It doesn't matter what you saw. I took the pills they gave me. I nodded when they talked about therapy. I played the part of the recovering victim, but I kept the piece of charcoal. The doctors missed it. I dug it out of my boot lining before they took my clothes. It's a piece of burnt wood, but it's not from the tower. It's gray pine bark. And on the inside, carved into the wood, is a frequency, not numbers, a pattern of jagged lines. And when I hold it, I can hear the hum. I moved to the city, San Francisco. Millions of people, noise, traffic, lights. I thought I would be safe in the crowd, but last week I was on the subway, rush hour, packed in shoulder to shoulder. The train went into a tunnel, the lights flickered. For a second, the reflection in the window changed. The man standing behind me wasn't a commuter in a suit. He was wearing a gray mechanic's jumpsuit, and where his face should have been there was nothing but smooth, blank skin. I spun around. It was just a guy in a suit looking at his phone, but as I turned back, my phone buzzed. A text message. Unknown number. I opened it. It wasn't text. It was an audio file. I didn't want to play it, too. But my thumb hovered over the screen, trembling. I pressed play. Hoo-wee, hoo-wee, the whistle, the wind whistle, and then Ray's voice. The signal is strong, Caleb, but the battery is running low. We need you to come back to the mountain. The effigy is growing again. I threw the phone onto the tracks. I ran out of the station, but you can't run from a frequency. It's in the walls now. It's in the power lines. It's in the hum of the refrigerator. They didn't just burn the tower. They turned the whole world into a receiver. And I'm the only one who can hear the broadcast. So if you go hiking in Tom Head, if you see a stone circle, or if you find a radio that works when it shouldn't, don't answer. Because once you answer, you become part of the circuit. And the ashwalkers are always looking for a new fuse. The scratching started on my apartment window last night. I live on the 40th floor. There is no balcony. I pulled the curtains. I turned up the TV. But I know what's out there. A shadow with my face, wearing a red flannel shirt, waiting for me to open the hatch. And the worst part, I'm starting to think, maybe I should. Because the silence in here is getting loud, and the fire was so warm. I think I'll go unlock the window now. Ray says it's time to check in. End of log. The first thing they tell you about surviving a fall from 50 feet is that you're lucky. The second thing they tell you, usually while looking at a clipboard and avoiding your eyes, is that the human body is a catalog of soft tissues that remember trauma better than the brain does. They were right about the tissue. They were wrong about the luck. I didn't die on the slope of Tom Head. That would have been the clean exit. Instead, I woke up 3 days later in a sterile room in Reading, tethered to machines that beeped in a rhythm that was suspiciously similar to the hum of the tower's tension rods. The air smelled of antiseptic and floor wax, a violent contrast to the gasoline and ozone scent that had filled my lungs for weeks. My leg was encased in a fixator, a cage of metal pins screwed directly into the bone, and my hands were bandaged like a boxer's. For the first 2 days they kept me sedated. It was a mercy. In the twilight of the morphine drip, I wasn't in the hospital. I was back in the glass box watching the smoke curl under the door. But when the fog lifted, the real horror began. It wasn't the pain. It was the evidence. A doctor came in on the 3rd morning, Dr. Aris. He looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from seeing things that don't fit into medical textbooks. He held up a plastic vial. Inside, suspended in a clear saline solution, was a clump of black particulate matter. "We aspirated this from your lungs, Caleb," he said, his voice quiet. "We thought it was smoke inhalation, standard carbon buildup." He tapped the vial. The black dust swirled, and for a second it didn't just float, it organized. It formed a spiral, then dispersed. "It's not carbon," he said. "It's organic. Spores. Ancient fungal spores mixed with pulverized silicate. The lab guys say it looks like fossilized pollen from the Pleistocene era. Do you have any idea how you inhaled prehistoric dust in a national forest?" I breathed the smoke, I croaked. "The effigy, I burned it." Dr. Aris stared at me for a long moment, then slipped the vial into his pocket. "The police are outside. They want to talk about the fire. But Caleb, whatever was up there, it's deep in your bronchial tubes. We can't scrub it all out. It's integrated." Then came the sheriff, accompanied by a man in a gray suit who didn't introduce himself. They didn't ask about ash walkers or bark men. They placed a digital recorder on the bedside table. "We recovered the hard drive from the base station," the suit said. "We have the audio logs from your entire tenure at the tower." "Then you know," I said, a surge of vindication hitting me. "You heard Ray! You heard the intruders!" The suit pressed play. I closed my eyes, waiting for Ray's gravelly voice. But what came out of the speaker was just me. Base, this is Tom Head. Reporting in. Over. Silence. Static. Yeah, Ray, just unpacking. View is a lot. Silence. Static. There's someone up here. I saw them. Silence. Static. For 10 minutes I listened to a one-sided conversation. I heard myself laughing at jokes that weren't there. I heard myself screaming at empty air. I heard myself pleading for help to a radio frequency that was nothing but dead white noise. No, I whispered. He answered. I heard him. Pareidolia, the suit said, turning off the recorder. Auditory matrixing. You were alone, Caleb. The isolation broke you. You invented a friend, and then you invented a monster. I didn't invent the fire. I shouted, rattling the bed rails. I didn't invent the 12 men who poured the gas. The sheriff leaned in. The arson investigators found 12 distinct pour patterns, but only one set of boot prints, Caleb. Yours. You walked in a circle around the tower pouring the fuel. We matched the tread. We matched the gait. They had an answer for everything. The frantic logic of the bureaucracy is a powerful thing. It can rewrite reality. They painted a picture of a disturbed young man who went into the woods and lost his mind. They didn't charge me. The psychiatric evaluation deemed me temporarily incompetent due to acute stress psychosis. It was a get-out-of-jail-free card wrapped in a straitjacket of shame. I almost believed them. I wanted to believe them. It's easier to be crazy than to be hunted. But then came the package. It arrived 2 months later at my new address in San Francisco. I had moved to the city seeking the safety of numbers. I rented a studio on the 4th floor, not the 40th. I couldn't handle the height anymore, hoping the noise of traffic would drown out the hum in my ears. The package was wrapped in brown butcher paper tied with twine. No return address, just my name written in a blocky charcoal script. Inside was the doll. It was small, no bigger than a finger. It was made of the same twisted roots as the effigy, bound with the same rusted wire. But it wasn't wearing a flannel shirt. It was wearing a scrap of hospital identification bracelet. My hospital bracelet. The one I'd cut off and thrown in the trash bin at Reading General. And underneath the doll was a note, not paper. A slab of gray pine bark. Carved into the wood were coordinates. 39 degree 56, 22.0, N 122 degree 45, 11.0 W. The coordinates of Tom Head Peak. And below that, a single line of text, the circuit is incomplete. That was the moment the denial died. The police hadn't found the bracelet. The doctors hadn't kept it. Something had gone into the hospital trash, retrieved it, and brought it to me. The Ray hallucination couldn't mail packages. I realized then that the suit was wrong. I hadn't invented Ray. Ray wasn't a person. Ray was the frequency. And the frequency didn't stop at the tree line. I started noticing the glitches in the city. It started with the electronics. My laptop would wake up in the middle of the night, the screen glowing a dead static gray. The text on the screen would rearrange itself. Emails from my boss would scramble into phonetic warnings: run, hide, burn. Then the water. I'd turn on the tap to brush my teeth, and the water would smell like ozone and pine needles. One morning I spat into the sink and saw black particulates swirling in the porcelain. The spores, they were reproducing. The haunting wasn't violent. It was pervasive. It was the feeling of being watched by the infrastructure itself. I'd walk down the street and the streetlights would flicker in sequence as I passed, buzzing with that same two-note whistle. Hoo-wee! I stopped taking the elevator. The hum of the motor sounded like the barkman's voice. I stopped looking in mirrors, because every time I did, the reflection lagged, just by a fraction of a second. The Caleb in the mirror would blink after I blinked, and his eyes were getting grayer, flat, dead, like river stones. Last week I tried to leave. I packed a bag. I was going to drive east to the desert somewhere without trees, without reception. I got to my car in the parking garage. Sitting in the passenger seat was the effigy. Not the small doll, the full-sized one, the one I had burned. It smelled of wet ash and gasoline. Its burlap head brushed the ceiling of the sedan. The button eyes stared at me. I screamed and ran back to the elevator. When I returned with the building security guard, the car was empty. But on the dashboard, etched into the dust, was a message: "Static is just a voice you haven't learned to speak yet." That brings me to tonight, to this final log. I'm back in my apartment. I've pushed the dresser in front of the door, not to keep them out, to keep me in, because I understand now. The sheriff was right about one thing. I did pour the gasoline, I did walk in the circles, but it wasn't me driving the body. The isolation psychosis wasn't a breakdown. It was a takeover. The spores in my lungs, they aren't just dust. They are receivers, micro antennae embedded in my blood. When I was on the mountain, I didn't just burn a tower. I completed a circuit. I turned myself into the new tower. I am the repeater station, and Ray is the broadcast. The scratching at the window has stopped. It's been replaced by a tapping, gentle, rhythmic, tap, tap, tap. It's coming from the glass. But I'm on the 4th floor. There is no balcony. I'm looking at the window now. The city lights outside are blurring. The fog is rolling in. But this fog isn't white. It's black. And floating in the fog, pressed against the glass, is a face. It's a bark mask. But the eyes are mine. It's holding up a radio handset. The cord trails off into the darkness, plugging into nothing. The speaker on my desk, my computer speakers, my phone, even the intercom on the wall, they all just clicked on, synchronized. Ray's voice is coming through all of them, stereo surround sound. "Caleb, the signal's degrading. We need a booster. You have the carbon, you have the fire. Let us in." I can feel the heat rising in my chest. It's not anxiety, it's literal heat. My lungs are burning. I coughed into my hand a moment ago. I coughed up a spark, a literal glowing ember. I'm not the victim of this story. I'm the match. I'm going to open the window, not because I want to, but because I'm burning up from the inside. If I don't let the fire out, I'm going to explode. So this is my advice to you, to anyone watching this. If you ever find a place where the silence feels heavy, where the wind sounds like a whistle, don't stay. And if you hear a voice on the radio that knows your name, don't answer. Because the moment you acknowledge them, you give them a frequency. And once they have your frequency, they never stop broadcasting. The barkman is pointing at the latch. My hand is moving toward it. My skin looks like wood. My veins look like wire. I think I'm going to be beautiful when I burn. Ray says the view from the top is going to be a lot. Goodbye. End of transmission.